ERC's talk on driving the Silk Road, chaired by myself, William de Laszlo, and our keynote speaker this evening is Douglas McWilliams, and it's a great privilege because he is one of the world's leading economists out there. And so Douglas, thank you very, very much for joining us. You might remember Douglas for his book, The Flat White Economy, which was a bestseller, and what the digital economy means for the future. And Douglas is also a professional economist as well, kind of throughout his whole life. He's been leading the field. This evening, we have an unusual talk for the ERC, which is Douglas's experience in driving the Silk Road halfway across the world in a Bentley. And I'm very excited to sit here and listen to you, Douglas. So thank you. And without much further ado, we'll hand it over. But before we do that, there is a couple of housekeeping notes. You will find on your keyboards, or however you're set up at home, there's an ability to ask questions through the Q&A button. And so we'll try and field some of those at the end, or clump them together. So Douglas and I will be managing the technology. So without much further ado, Douglas, over to you.
Well, William, thank you so much for taking the trouble to introduce me, and thank you to your family. I gather your grandfather founded the Economic Research Council, so I'm immensely privileged that you've taken the time to chair this. This is going to be a slightly unusual thing because I'm going to talk about economics, I'm going to talk about politics, and I'm also going to talk about endurance rallying. And I'm not sure that you've ever had that mix together before.
I don't think we have. This is a talk with a difference, and I'm sure our listeners and regular attendees, we're full of economists and young professionals, so we'll be very excited about it. So thank you.
Well, let's see if it works. We'll do our very best. I'm going to start by talking about politics, really, which is China's relationship with the rest of the world and what's going on. I'm going to move on to describe a study that was launched actually almost exactly a year ago in Beijing as part of my financing of doing the rally. We got sponsorship from the Charles Institute of Building, and we wrote this report, and the profits went to pay for some spare parts for the Bentley, I think, mainly. But that helped get us across on the rally. And the Belt and Road Initiative is China's key infrastructural initiative. So I want to talk a little bit about that. We did the study showing what the economic impact might be. Obviously, that was all a year ago. And so we need to talk about the impacts of coronavirus and how that changes all the numbers and things. And then we get on to what I think of as the interesting stuff, which is driving the Silk Road and the rally. And that's the second half. So let's move on. Right, it goes the other way. Right. I think you need a bit of perspective to look at the relationship between China and the world. And probably the most important thing is to think a little bit about huge economies. Now, only 3 countries have ever been the largest economy in the world. India, or what is now India, was the largest until round about between 14 and 1500. And then actually overtook again around about 1700 to be the largest economy in the world. By then it was India. China was otherwise the largest economy in the world for the entire period from 1400 to 1890. And then the US has been the largest economy since 1890. Now the forecasts say that China should overtake again in the 2030s. And some forecasters say that India could overtake China sometime in the late 21st century. Now that tells us 2 different things, I think. The first is that for China, sort of globalization and the economic renaissance of China, to us, it's something new. To them, it's a return to normality, the normality of the last 500 years. And so they don't see China as a major economy, as something unusual, in perhaps the same way as we do in the West. The second thing that emerges from this is that for the next few years, we're going to have 2 pretty large economies, neck and neck. And possibly as we end the century, we'll have 3 very large economies, neck and neck. it's not always a force for stability if you've got people competing to be number one and people competing to have the political clout and so on. And I think we may be moving into a period of this sort of instability. Now, at the moment, the relationships between China and the world, there are clearly tensions. There are trade tensions, particularly between China and the United States. There's the different narratives about coronavirus. From a Chinese perspective, they bust a gut to try and stop it spreading, shut themselves down, and really went to tremendous lengths. From a Western perspective, they didn't provide information as early as possible, and there is a suggestion that they used the time before they made the information clear to buy up most of the protective equipment that was available on the market, to corner the market in that. These are the two different perspectives on this. We will probably find out eventually which story is closest to the truth. There is a battle for intellectual property going on. I was on the main board of Marconi as part of the team that tried to rescue Marconi, and there was an issue of whether we would merge with the company Huawei, which is now, its role in the UK's infrastructure is being debated at the moment. And we actually met their board in Shenzhen, which is where they're headquartered. And we asked them about intellectual property. And their take was, our views on this may be changing because now we have so much intellectual property of our own. And I think that captures the view that in the East, the idea that intellectual property is sacrosanct is not yet as well established as it has been in the West. And I think there are different views about exactly how much it's legitimate to nick up other people's ideas. And these different views are all over the world. You've got an issue in cyberspace. The Australian economy recently was nearly brought to a halt, and the Prime Minister went on TV and claimed that it was something to do with China. I think using electronic means is probably at least the least efficient way of trying to stop Australia working. What I would have done is put some refrigerated trucks full of beer in the middle of each large city and just put up a sign saying free beer. And I'm pretty certain that Australia could have come to a halt quite fast if you did that. But the Chinese, if you believe the Australian Prime Minister, use slightly more electronic means to try and achieve the same result. And we're only stopped from doing it when the US administration essentially threatened to retaliate. I've been told by the British Security Agency, whether it's true or not, I don't no idea, that every single lab researching into coronavirus vaccines has been hacked into, and they think from the Far East. So there are interesting things going on in cyberspace at the moment. You've got tensions with India. You've got 3 flashpoints in the South China Sea between China and the Philippines, China and Indonesia, China and Malaysia. And of course, you've got Hong Kong, where security legislation basically making Hong Kong citizens subject to Chinese law. The law was implemented yesterday. I've always felt the Hong Kong thing that one country, two systems was an unstable position. It was meant to last for 50 years. It's lasted for 23 years. At the time, I thought it was unlikely to last for more than 10 years. And I'm afraid I did see one country, two systems as a way of the Chinese rather generously giving the British face to allow us to withdraw without as much egg on our face as would otherwise have been the case. We didn't have the power to stay in Hong Kong. If the Chinese wanted Hong Kong, they had the ability simply to turn off the taps and cut off Hong Kong's water supply. We had to move out when they wanted us to. But I think that the one country, two systems basis actually did create a useful smokescreen to enable us to get out. the situation now is that we don't really have much influence to be able to stop it happening. We can use embarrassment if we want to, but it will cost us as much. The big issue, I think, is whether we allow those people who remain British passport holders in Hong Kong to settle in the UK. The numbers are very large, but on the other hand, one would imagine that they would be a great boost to the economy if they were to join us. Now, the Chinese are pretty smart people. So the question is, why are they fighting a war on so many fronts at the same time? And I've wondered about this for a while, and I've got an idea. I can't pretend it's the definite explanation, but my sense is that they feel, particularly now in 2020, partly because of coronavirus and partly because of tensions in the West, that the West is uniquely divided. It's divided in various areas. It's divided between the United States and Europe, and obviously President Trump has got quite a lot to do with it. It's also divided within most countries between the left and the right. We've seen the demonstrations and so on. And of course, some of them, I think the tensions have been exacerbated by the scale of lockdown. And my tentative explanation is that one of the reasons the Chinese are taking the position they're taking, maybe because they see us as unusually divided at the moment, and they see an opportunity. After all, there is quite a chance that President Trump will no longer be president by the end of this year or by the beginning of next year. So I think they may think that this is the time when we're more divided than we might be in future. Anyway, that's a tentative explanation. Whatever it is, there are these tensions. I don't know whether they're going to get worse or whether they're going to get better. And frankly, they put us in Britain, in Europe, in an unenviable situation, because we have a major ally, even if we don't feel quite as close at the moment, basically taking the line that they don't want us to deal with another country, which is so large in terms of the world economy that it is very difficult for us to ignore it. And we're being given a harsh choice of whether we deal with them or not. In an ideal world, we would be working and trading with both China and the United States. I hope that remains possible, but I can't guarantee it will. And that's where we stand today. Now, let me turn to the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI. We did a lot of work to try and work out the economic impact. And the BRI is a sort of moving feast. Things keep on getting joined in, and it keeps on changing its nature. So let me just try to tell you how we did the work. First of all, we used the CEBR's World Economic League Table modeling techniques. We measured the impact of the announced projects, and then we scaled up from what we thought would probably be the unannounced projects. I'll take you through those things that we assumed. We got asked by the European Commission to develop the techniques for estimating infrastructure, the economic impact of infrastructure on lots of different parts of the world. And we did that report for them about 10 years ago. And we used the techniques that we developed for the European Commission to do this. We take account of trade effects, and that makes some of the results actually surprising, because the country that benefits second most in the whole world from the Belt and Road Initiative is the United States, which has nothing to do with it. But of course, the United States benefits from the second round effect, which is the trade effect. We measured the impact looking out to 2040. And our estimate was that the total spend would come up to something like $8 trillion in total over this period. And our calculation was that 8 trillion would give a boost to world GDP of 7 trillion per annum. So in pure rate of return terms, you're getting quite a decent bang for your buck, 7 trillion a year for 8 trillion of spend. Let me compare with some of the things that happened in the past that have been on a similar scale. You've got the Roman roads. The system of Roman roads was developed over about 250 years, 80,000 kilometers. The Eisenhower Interstate highway system, that's 64,000 kilometers. That happened very much more quickly. Now, the road element of the Belt and Road Initiative is actually slightly smaller than both of these. It's only 60,000 kilometers of new or upgraded roads. But of course, there's a whole lot else as well, because we're in a different world from simply building roads. There are many other things, elements in infrastructure today. We estimate that the total spend under the Belt and Road Initiative will be between 10 and 15 times as much as the total that the Romans spent or the Americans spent. Now, I will, I'm afraid, read bits of this out on this slide. These are the extra things that we assumed. A global 5G network, a global energy interconnector, an Arctic belt and road. There are Chinese and Russian initiatives already there. The Americans are trying to stop them, may not. The Nordics will probably be the major people participating, particularly the Danes. We assumed that Western Europe would eventually come in. Now, obviously that won't happen if the scale of the tensions between China and the US exacerbates. But logically, Western Europe is the far end of the Belt and Road, starting in China, going through Russia, and ending up in Western Europe, just as where I drove. So various countries, in theory, should go. We sort of think the main Western port will end up as Rotterdam, because that's the obvious port for it to be. We think there'll be something autonomous. We think there'll be a hyperloop. We think there'll be a green element with renewable energy sources, and rather more importantly, storage. Energy storage is going to be one of the big stories of the next few years, I think. We think there'll be Pacific and Latin American belts and roads. Of course, there'll be much more maritime than the land transport, which is going across the Eurasian continent. And we think there'll be a knowledge version going around as well, which fits together. Once these things get going, they tend to develop a bit of momentum. Well, who gains? It's not entirely surprising that the biggest benefit is China. But what is totally unexpected to most people is the second biggest beneficiary is the United States. The United States benefits because anything that floats the boat up in the water helps everyone, helps even the people hanging on who aren't actually passengers. And any increase in world GDP and any increase in world trade will lap its way around the world. Just think of those products, effectively, that you can only get from the United States. A lot of them electronic products. They're likely to benefit even if the United States remains fairly aloof. Of the other countries we expect to benefit, Russia is there, Japan, Indonesia, Korea, the UK, and so on. The list is here, and the report is available, by the way. In proportionate terms, the picture is a wee bit different. The biggest single gain is Mongolia. Now, our calculated numbers, 26.8% gain. That's plus or minus 20% either way. That's the sort of scale of the margin of error. The decimal point is a bit spurious in this, but that gives you an idea of what calculated they come at. I'll tell you a little bit more about it when I talk about Mongolia from Belt and Road. Pakistan, major contributor, and this is part of the tension between China and India, because China is increasingly getting involved in Pakistan, and the Indians are concerned about it. Kyrgyzstan, or the Kyrgyz Republic, Russia, obviously Russia, you can't get from China to the west without going through Russia, and Russia is a major potential beneficiary. And then some others down there. You may be surprised to see Denmark. That is a calculation based on the Arctic Belt and Road. You may be surprised to see the Netherlands, but that's because of our assumption that ultimately Rotterdam will be the western hub of the Belt and Road. Who knows? This is assumption, but that's why you get these things. Now, these effects are non-marginal. I mean, the impact on Mongolia boosts GDP by a quarter. The impact on Pakistan boosts GDP by a fifth. Kyrgyz Republic, Russia, not far off a fifth. These are marginal changes, and certainly the largest ever changes, that can be attributed to an infrastructural project. So for them, they've got a lot of skin in the game. Now, coronavirus is going to change this. We've moved on a year. Projects will have been delayed. The world economy is going to be down probably somewhere peak to trough about 15%. We think world GDP will be down about 5% this year. World trade in goods is also probably going to be lower, and lower in the longer term, not so much from protectionism, although trade wars are a potential threat, but rather more from the fact that people reassess sourcing issues in a world where resilience has become much more important. And of course, a lot of things like 3D printing mean that arbitrage on cheaper labor costs is rather less important today than it might once have been. So I think we may see a bit of onshoring resulting from that. There's obviously the issue of China's relationships with the West. And if the war moves into a much more aggressive phase, where basically you have to take sides, there will be no neutral countries, so to speak, that will certainly impact this, and it could bring the thing to a shuddering halt. I'm assuming that won't happen. I'm assuming that what we're seeing at the moment is a temporary phenomenon based on a debate where China, I think, sees the West as temporarily weak, and therefore they are trying to make the gains that they can at this stage. But I may be wrong. If that is the case, if we are going back to something that is, less non-speaks and much more collaborative sort of existence, then although the timescales may change, the Belt and Road Initiative still makes sense. And bear in mind that post-COVID, lots of people are going to be looking to infrastructure to boost their economies. Indeed, Prime Minister Johnson has announced today 5 billion of spending, which is obviously rather less than the 8 trillion that we're assuming for Belt and Road, but it's the same idea that infrastructure is a way of getting back after being in a situation like this. Now, that's the heavy stuff. Let's come to the more frothy, lighter stuff. Driving the Silk Road, I wrote this book, Driving the Silk Road, about our fun going across the Gobi Desert and going in this endurance rally from Beijing to Paris. It's called Peking to Paris. The rally was first run in 1907. And one of the stipulations was, one of the rules is that you had to take a journalist with you, who, and when you stopped at telegraph halts, you had to broadcast your story back. And I tried to imitate them by posting a blog every night when we had some kind of ability to get Wi-Fi or in some other way connect to the internet. There were a few nights when we were in camps when that was impossible. It's a long route. It's about 16,000 kilometers by the time we made some navigational errors. I sort of thought we ought to do it in a rather stately car. And my father had Bentleys when I was a kid. So my brother and I went in this 1958 Bentley S1, which is quite a comfortable car. And when we had to spend the night in the car, I have to say, it's a lot more comfortable than camping, sleeping in the car. The heart of the rally is when you go across the Gobi Desert. I can show you some pictures in a moment. It's pretty brutal. It would be brutal, but you could do it if you're going 20 miles an hour. The trouble is that on the rally speeds, you're either driving all night or you're tasked to go round about 40 miles an hour. That's when it gets interesting, because that's when it starts wrecking the car. And when you see the pictures, you'll understand why. Nevertheless, we're amazingly lucky because only 21 cars who'd started managed to finish without being either towed or picked up on a flatbed. And we were one of the 21, and probably the most improbable of the 21, because our car was by far the closest to being the sort of thing that might have come out of a showroom. Now, the book was published last December. I hope you'll all buy it. The reviews were remarkably charming, so I'm very grateful to those who've done so. I'm going to take you to some of the bits that we went to and my sort of quick observations. China, we had the opportunity of driving across Western China, which very few people who go to China do. Most people go to the eastern coast of China, to Beijing, to Shanghai. We went across drove all the way across China to the Mongolian border. We went to a place called Hohhot. Hohhot has been growing at an annual rate of 25% for 15 years now. Hohhot's population is about the same size as Rome. It's a bit over 3 million. It was 1 million 10 years ago. It's just quite astounding. You can see the Chinese investment in infrastructure. What is clear is that Western China is the area that's really, that sort of, you know, it's the Wild West, it's the rags to riches story of China. The rest of China looks a bit like the West and has slowed down a bit. In the East, no. We counted 61 cranes in Hohhot, and we were stuck in the traffic jam for nearly 3 hours. Hohhot it used to be the dairy farming center. It's now the big data center of China. And one of the things that you notice in China is the extensive use of facial recognition technology. I've never before put on a slideshow where I've shown a picture of a toilet. And the reason I've shown a picture of a toilet is because the facial recognition technology has even got there, which is a bit embarrassing. When you go in, you have to let them take your photograph before they give you your 2 pieces of loo paper, which is your ration. And the reason they take a picture is so you don't come back and get another 2, which may be a false investment, but it is what they do. China is, of course, like all amazingly rapidly developing places, you see a sort of contrast between the places that are really sophisticated. On the right-hand side is the Great Wall. On the left-hand side, we're at a motorway toll booth, and this is their method of horse transport. And the horse is just in the back of the pickup, and it was just tied in. And the horse doesn't look terribly pleased, I have to say. Mongolia, very, very different. China, a lot of it, you could be in the West. Mongolia is suddenly, you go into, it's one of the least inhabited countries in the world. It is absolutely huge. And you can see in the picture the quality of the roads. There is one motorway going across. Other than that, the roads are like this. They are quite sensitive to potential domination by the Russians and the Chinese. And as a result in Mongolia, their second language is English, and they make quite an effort to have links with parts of the world other than Russia and China, but clearly they are going to be dominated by the 2 countries next to them. Mongolia is full of minerals. Mining is the key industry by a massive margin. And of course, the thing about minerals is that they are hugely expensive to transport, which is why Mongolia is already benefiting massively from the Belt and Road Initiative and will continue to so. There is a scope for infrastructural development. I'm going to go quickly through the next 2 pictures just to give you an idea of the Mongolian roads, which will explain to you why Mongolia is likely to have new roads built. This is my favorite picture, and it's a very typical Mongolian road. Basically, they're just tracks in the desert. And boy, it's wonderful to be out there. I mean, some of the scenes are just incredible, but they are, it's all a bit different from the built-up bits of London. Kazakhstan is also heavily based on minerals, but also on oil. And it's also the world's 7th largest wheat producer. It's much more plugged into the Belt and Road Initiative. This road that the picture is on the right was built under the Belt and Road Initiative. The electricity pylons that were on their side when the picture was taken, but presumably are up by now, also part of the Belt and Road Initiative electricity links. Their capital, Nur-Sultan, that's the picture on the left-hand side, looks like a slightly down market version of Dubai. And I think some of the same architects may have got there. Examples of the minerals, the picture in the middle, there's the tailings from a copper mine. The picture on the right-hand side, the stuff that looks like steam is actually ash. It's a coal-fired power station near Pavlodar. And again, this is part of the Kazakhstan economic development, trying to get the best access to the minerals that exist there. I think we'd all expected that China would be developing fast, that Mongolia was going to have to change its nature, and that Kazakhstan, again, the mineral production would change the way it was moving. I think the biggest shock to everyone was how much Russia had changed. I've been to Russia, I think 4 times previously. The rally had been to Russia at 3 yearly intervals since the rally was first reinstituted in 1987. And all the previous rallies, people had been killed, people had been mugged, and people had been kidnapped. There used to be roadblocks, often actually run by the police, where they would stop you. We were told to take $20,000 and build a safe in the car and have packets of $1,000, which was the normal accepted sum to pay ransom if you were halted. And that's what had happened previously. So the expectation was the $20,000 would disappear as you paid it off to various people. Actually, we finished with $18,000, and the $2,000 that we spent was on car repairs. We didn't actually spend anything on this. There were no drunks. Every time you stop, your car is surrounded by people, and surrounded by people at petrol stations and places like that. We never once smelt alcohol in anyone's breath. And if you look at the life expectancy figures, they show that Russian life expectancy is rising amazingly sharply, which is consistent with the theory that drinking has become less pervasive than it once was. We didn't see any crime. It may simply mean it's been nationalized, but whatever, or it may mean the crime gangs have been bought off already, I don't know. But we didn't see any crime. And actually, we felt safe and reasonably secure all the way through Russia. Now, I had the good fortune to go to a Foreign Office briefing on the Russian economy about 2 months before I went off on the rally. And one of the statistics I picked up there that really surprised me was that there are 750,000 enterprises in Russia selling software to the UK. Wow. Now, these, I suspect, are probably people working from home doing bits of coding or something like that. What they put into the coding is interesting, and who knows. But I think there must be quite a lot of people who've got big software contracts who subcontract it, because there are markets on the internet where you can go and buy amounts of coding and so on. And it does look as if that is the coming thing in Russia, and their dependence on commodities, minerals, and of course oil is diminishing. Now, this gives you some idea of the sorts of things that were going on while we were driving through Russia. The picture of the car, you can see that the driver's side wheel is not exactly in the vertical plane. It's actually at an angle of about 25 degrees to the vertical. What had happened, and I've just downloaded a picture from the workshop manual, which is in the inset. What had happened is that the pin which connects the stub axle to the steering had shattered. And that's why the thing is just hanging on by a little bit, but not anything very much. It's the thing in the blue circle, in a blue ellipse on the left-hand side. When we got into Novosibirsk, we found the mechanics gather round because this is their big payday. They can pay for most of the rest of the year when the rally comes into town. So they all crowd round. And we got this guy who was recommended by our local Sherpas, and he built a new pin, a complete replacement pin from liquid metal. We presented him with the bits of the broken one, and he built a new one, and he fabricated it just like that. It took him about 3 hours. Pretty damn impressive, and gives you some sense of what actually happens out there when you go beyond the normal sort of place where things are all done to rule or whatever. Now, the other thing you can see in the car is that the rear springs aren't working terribly well, and they had collapsed, in fact. Unfortunately, we couldn't fix those. Taking the car to bits, it would have taken about a week and a half, which is time we didn't have. So we had to drive all the way back to the UK and indeed up to Lincolnshire, where the car is currently still being restored, to get those fixed. So the back ended up looking pretty heavily depreciated. Trains in Russia are basically only used for freight. I mean, there are some tourist ones, but they're fairly minimal. The average number of buggies is about 70. So if you happen to go to a level crossing and there's a train there, you turn your engine off. You're going to be there for 20 minutes minimum, and you just have to put up with that. But you can see the trains and the roads, how the infrastructure in Russia now looks pretty damn modern. The picture on the right is the Altai region of Siberia. And that would have been an underdeveloped area for a very long time. But if you look at the quality of the road, certainly it's a hell of a lot better than in Camden. When we went to Western Europe, actually the funny thing is that we moved from places where we felt that we were sort of reasonably comfortable. We moved to the right of our comfort zone. We moved into an area where we actually sort of got slightly nervous because speed cops and people like that caused a certain amount of havoc with the rally. And we did get the impression that Western Europe may be slightly overregulated. I mean, we took this picture in Germany, and the Germans apparently need to have a road warning sign put up, warning them not to drive into trees, because obviously you would drive into a tree unless you had a warning telling you not to. You can see the picture, it's there. And this is a different story. This is taking place 200 meters from the Volkswagen factory with the famous 4 chimneys. And our car had broken down. It broke down, refused to proceed on 40 times in the 36 days of the rally. So this wasn't the first time we had to do it. My brother is in the green overalls. He only told me on the last day that he had in fact brought another pair of overalls for me to wear, and they remained unused. But Mike is a brilliant engineer. We were getting on. They have people called sweeps, and the sweeps are they're some of the best mechanics in the world, and they follow you around, and they try and sweep you up if you're broken down. In this case, a repair to a fuel tank, which had got made when the fuel tank got broken in the Mongolian desert. The masking tape had eventually melted and was blocking up the fuel supply. We thought we'd broken a fuel pump, which was a nuisance because the nearest appropriate fuel pump was about 200 miles away. Fortunately, that hadn't happened. What had happened is that the fuel lines had got filled with sort of melted or dissolved masking tape, and so it all had to be blown out. Anyway, the police came up, and we, of course, by this stage, were dead keen to preserve our record of not being flatbedded or towed, but they were threatening to tow us off the road. And I had to try and chat them up and explain to them, fortunately in English, and they spoke very good English, that we weren't going to be there, we were just moving. You can see they're rushing to try and get the thing finished before the police finally tow us away. Anyway, they took my name and address, and they said, we may have to charge you for the mess you made of the road. Well, petrol on the road doesn't make a big mess. And I only found out about 3 weeks ago that the municipality of Wolfsburg is trying to extort 2,501 euros from my insurers for the cost of clearing up an alleged oil spillage. Now, I guess that amounts to 20 euros for the guy who had to sweep whatever was being swept, and 2,481 euros for admin costs. I mean, it's a scam. And there it is. These are sorts of things. And of course, I suspect the Brits are probably the only people who actually pass on the information that allows them to chase on this kind of thing. I bet no other European country does, even though they've signed up to do it. That's a guess, but who knows? Anyway, we got there. That was a great thing. We arrived. And the picture is my 94-year-old mother who'd stood in the sun for 2 hours waiting for us, greeting my brother. And you can see how big his smile is. I think he was pretty damn delighted that he'd finally got there, and he was the guy who made it happen. If he hadn't been there, well, I certainly wouldn't have done it on my own because my mechanical skills are zilch. What are the observations? There's a huge increase in transcontinental transport, the trade between Russia and China. The economies are getting integrated. We got stuck in the queues behind the lorries, so we saw it. There's an interesting thing about them reducing border formalities. We got stuck for 7 hours at one border, but there's something called the Eurasian Economic Union, which is Russia, Kazakhstan, Belarus, and Kyrgyzstan. And there, whenever you went through borders in that, at most you waited 20 minutes and sometimes less than that. This is clearly something that has some reality for them. I think if you go to Eastern China, you can get the impression that they're starting to get mature. China is a mature economy. Once you go to Western China, you realize that there's still a lot of China that's not a mature economy and still has a long way to go. Russia, we saw as very much clearing up its act, and the IT sector in particular. We never had Wi-Fi problems in Russia. The IT sector is the leading sector now, even if the statistics don't say it. It's pretty damn obvious that's what's going on. Mongolia and Kazakhstan are essentially minerals-based economies, and they are dead keen on BRI, and it will transform their economies, whether it's 25% or 45%, and in the end, economics is not good enough to tell you. Coronavirus will slow it all down, but the economics are still there, unless, and that's the big question, relationships between China and the West deteriorate further. Now, my thinking is that the recent deterioration is temporary, but I can't guarantee that. And if it's not, we've got some interesting issues to have to deal with. So thank you very much for paying attention. Obviously, it's greatly in my interest if you're prepared to buy the book. It's available on Amazon, Driving the Silk Road, halfway across the road in a Bentley S1. Everyone that's reviewed it on Amazon has given it 5 stars, but that's only 2 people, so don't treat that as necessarily a representative sample. People have been very kind about it. And I'm delighted to take any questions you've got. So thank you very much, William.
Well, absolute pleasure. Normally there's a round of applause, so I'll give you a round of applause. Thank you so much, Douglas. That was absolutely fascinating and interesting. We've got certainly a couple of questions that have come in, but I might just kind of kick off. I'm sure there's members of the audience who want to know, maybe this is a next year project. How much does it cost to enter, and how often does the race run?
I'll give you the formal answer and then the informal answer, okay? The formal answer is that when we participated, we had to pay 58,000. Now I see one of the people who knows about the rally is about to ask a question, so I'm preparing myself for it. I reckon we spent about $250,000 in total on it. There were other people who seemed to be spending more because, you know, suddenly someone would appear with a few mechanics and a brand new engine would appear, and they were clearly flying business class when we were flying Ryanair. So other people clearly spent more than we did. Fantastic.
And how long is it each leg that you do 1,000 miles a day or 2,000 miles a day? Or do you get
the longest day was 680 something kilometers, and that was mainly on proper roads in Russia as we moved from Davydovo to St. Petersburg. You were typically doing about 400 kilometers in the desert, and that was tough, and that was fascinating as well, because trying to do 400 kilometers and trying to keep up your speed is what really puts the pressure on the car. If you're going 20 miles an hour, you could do it, but you're trying to go much faster than that.
Oh, absolutely fascinating. So we've got quite a few questions that have come in, and I'm going to, I will field them. I'm conscious, obviously, of time. At the ERC, we like to be punctual, so we will be finishing at 7 o'clock, so everybody can get to their dinners or evening drinks, or however you're choosing to spend your evening. So the first question, how will the economic development affect climate change?
How will the economic development affect climate change? Initially, it will probably be, if we're talking about Belt and Road alone, I would say for the first 10 years, it will probably be net negative. But we need to be just a bit careful, because we drove through the biggest wind farm in the world, and that's clearly making a major contribution. This is the Zhangqing wind farm, which, when fully completed, and that's going to be another 10 years, will be producing 20 gigawatts of power. Now, Britain roughly consumes 60 gigawatts of power. So one wind farm alone, with enough power to be able to produce a third of Britain's electricity needs, that big. I think as time changes, this will change. The vehicles will be based on much cleaner forms of power, and the transport will be much cleaner. In the short term, the transport will not be as clean as taking things by boat. It's very clear that the most eco-friendly way of transporting things at the moment is by boat. But that will change. And that will change as methods of propulsion, engines, methods of creating the power, if you're using electricity, as they all change. But it will take a while for that to happen.
Interesting. Thank you for that. The quick question on your book: is your book available in hard copy?
It is available in hard copy. There's both a Kindle edition and a hardcover. If you, it does say hardcover there on the screen, but it's in very, very small print. So I apologise for that.
Hopefully, it will be transferred to Audible soon, and I can get my kids to listen to it. That'd be fantastic.
I was asked if I wanted to record that, but the economics didn't really make much sense. I apologise for that.
Well,
but the book has got 53 photographs, and they're wonderful photographs.
Well, there we go. That makes a great decision for me to buy one for Walter, and then you can enjoy the photographs, and hopefully I can do a bit of reading with them. When you were talking about the economic kind of impact, the positive impact, were you assuming that tariffs would remain the same?
We assumed that there would be no major changes in tariffs for this, but what we did assume was that the border formalities, which are actually probably many times more important than the tariffs themselves, the border formalities would be improved dramatically. We've already seen this as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, that there are schemes to streamline things, so you have one guy looking at both sides and all that kind of stuff. It's already happening. You've also got the Eurasian Economic Union, which is a thing that does have an impact on tariffs, but has an impact on other things as well. But we basically didn't make any assumptions on major tariff changes. It was more simplification of procedures. Let's face it, if you hold a lorry up at the border for 7 hours, that is going to destroy any economics, and you'd have to have a pretty huge tariff change to act as a bigger barrier. You'd have to have quite a decent sized tariff to act as a bigger barrier than the 7 hour wait at the border, because just think of the wages you have to pay and all that. Got you.
Okay, I want to squeeze in these last few questions while we've got the remaining 7 minutes of the...
I'll answer a question from Mr. Woodcock, because he actually was one of the people who ran the rally. I see he's in the audience and he's put his hand up, so I do think his question would be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't know how to answer. Had you have a hand?
He had a hand up.
Okay, well, maybe Amy, if you could sort that, and then I'll ask the next couple of questions together. But how well was the route connected with the mobile phone signal?
The Gobi Desert, not, or not very much. China obviously fairly well, and Russia, once we got there, most of it was fairly well done.
Okay, understood. A question on the car itself. The car looks very similar to a Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud, which is essentially the same as a Bentley. Did it have air conditioning? And would you do the trip again? And would you, if you're doing the trip again, would you choose you doing it with a Bentley?
Right. The Silver Clouds and the Bentley S series were the same apart from the radiator grills, so it's basically the same car. Was it air conditioned? Technically, yes, but the air conditioning was so ineffective that we turned it off and we never used it. Would we do it again in that car? Not sure. It was very hard work. It was extremely comfortable, but it probably wasn't the right car. One of the problems is overhangs, because most of when you're going through the desert, you're going through gullies. And when you go through gullies, you really need something with very short overhangs to get through. And the overhangs on this car were so long that that's part of what got battered and what made the back of the car look very heavily depreciated.
Okay, brilliant. Slightly off-piece, kind of, not off-piece question, but I think it's relevant. How might Brexit affect the UK's relationship with China? I'm going to keep you to a minute or less than 30 seconds on that. We can squeeze in the final couple of questions.
I think the actual economic impact of Brexit is probably not all that great in terms of this. I think what has affected the relationship with China is China see Britain as weak at the moment because the political elite are fighting amongst themselves. You've got fights between the civil service and the government. You saw the cabinet secretary got sacked the other day there. That kind of stuff. And means that it's difficult for Britain to present a united front. And I think that does affect our relationship with China. I don't think the fact of Brexit itself has anything like the same impact.
Understood. So Guy Woodcock has actually, he's typed his question, but actually it's more of a statement just to let the audience know that the rally runs every 3 years and planning has started for 2022. So anybody who wants to participate in the 2022 rally would be, that I guess is open. And yeah, it takes about 3.5 years to plan the rally every time. So thank you for that.
Guy is one of the people who's planning it. His website posted the names of the participants for 2022 about 2 hours ago, and they were 8 times oversubscribed. 800
applicants. There we go. Did you observe any potential soft power in China? So your observations of the potential for Chinese soft power.
Well, I think China's greatest image at the moment of soft power is an image of success. It's more that they've got money, they've got technology, they've got goods and services available for sale at relatively good prices. And it's that mix of what they can offer. It's quite hard in the sense, it's not hard power in the sense of military power, but it is, I think they see economic power as probably their biggest offering.
Understood. We've got a question from Diana Beatty. I'm going to allow her to talk. I don't know if this is the way to do it, and to see if we can field her question from that. So, Diana, do you want to ask your question, or have I caught you off guard?
She's muted.
Diana will need to unmute herself.
So she needs to unmute herself. I don't think
she's still muted. At least she's still coming up as muted.
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, Diana, you have if you scroll your mouse over your own face, you'll see a red icon in the bottom left corner of that screen. That's what you click on to unmute yourself. No.
Should we do something in between while she
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've got another couple of questions. I suppose out of all the countries that you visited, this is another question that's coming in. Out of all the countries that you visited, where did you observe the most growth? Because you talked about Russia kind of leading that forefront, or on balance, were you looking at Russia versus China?
The most growth is in Ho Hot. Ho Hot is the fastest growing city in the world. It's amazing. I mean, you just don't see things like that happening in real life. When I was a kid, my father lived in a town near Kuala Lumpur called Petaling Jaya. We went there with a few hundred residents. By the time we left 10 years later, it had a population of 160,000 and was bigger than Bradford. That was fairly impressive. Ho Hot has taken this to a whole new level. It's the same rate of growth, but has continued up as the city has grown from 1 million to 3 million. Now it's got more people than Rome. That's the fastest growing bit. But the most surprising place was Russia, because I thought that Russia was run by gangsters and thugs and would never get anywhere. And it looks as if somehow they've cleaned up their act. They've become much more electronic, much more upmarket, much more technological. And it really doesn't look like the backward place that you got told that's the newspapers would lead you to expect.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a great place to end, and also a lovely segue. Douglas, do you want to introduce, we don't obviously have a date for the next talk, but the name of our guest speaker for our next talk, which is Has China Won? So he's a friend of yours.
Well, I know him. He's Madhubani. He's the ex-head of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Government at Singapore University. He's one of the world's great thinkers, and he's got a very Asian perspective on how the world is changing itself. And he's a guy you must listen to. He's really interesting. And particularly if you live in Europe and don't spend so much time in Asia. I was born in Asia and sort of more used to it. But if you live in Europe and you don't see that, you'll get such a different view of the world from listening to him.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time this evening, Douglas. Thank you on behalf of the ERC for sharing your wisdom and knowledge and your insights into a few of the fastest growing economies in the world. And I think will be a great, brilliantly to be followed up by an esteemed colleague of yours as well. Thank you all for joining. Look out for the announcement for the next date of the talk. And I hope you've all enjoyed yourself. Please, if you have any questions or recommendations to how we can run this better, please email them to Amy, who helps pull it all together. So thank you, Amy, and thank you, Douglas, for a fascinating evening. I wish you all the very best and a safe journey home, or for those who are traveling somewhere. Otherwise, a safe journey to the dining room table.
Thank you very much, William. Thanks.